session here at this wonderful print seminar, the printmaking in the expanded field. What do you think about the weather today? I had to take a shower at home before coming here. I don't know about you, but the other days we've been so generously poured down upon. So this is maybe for the better, okay? We think so. What we are talking about today, the main themes, will be like printmaking's transgressive possibilities, print and design, what kind of dimensions are possible there. That's been lacking in this seminar so far, so I'm glad it's here today. And is printmaking experiencing a stealth renaissance? That's a question we're going to come into. So these are very interesting and very exciting themes, and I'm looking forward to listening and then debating, okay? So I hope you join us. First, we have Margaret Miller, who is Director of Graphic Studio and Professor at the University of South Florida. Would you please come up? And she's going to talk, her title of her speech is The Transgressive Mark. So, Margaret, it's all yours.
Okay, so go to the first one. I'm delighted to be here with you today and honored that Her Majesty could be here in the audience. Made me a little bit nervous, I must say. I am also wish to thank Jan Pedersen for organizing this very informative seminar and Holger Kofod for moderating my particular panel. I am delighted to be joined on this panel by Andrew Rafferty and Sarah Suzuki, who will follow my remarks. Today I'm talking about production, a production studio, the making of art in a collaborative environment. We've talked about the artists who make prints. Today I want to also honor the printer artisan who collaborates with artists that come to work at our studio by invitation. What are the optimum conditions to encourage artists to use printmaking processes to experiment with new forms and concepts and make breakthroughs in their practice? Printmaking processes are acts of resistance by nature and certainly can be transgressive. In the United States, the university-based atelier is uniquely positioned to offer artists working in residence a broad array of technical processes and a collaborative environment that encourages a dialectical response to both contemporary conditions and the tools of printmaking. There are 3 major professional presses in the United States associated with universities. Tamarin Lithography Workshop was founded in 1960 in Los Angeles by June Wayne. A decade later, Tamarin moved to the University of New Mexico, where it is today and is recognized for its training of printmakers. Tandem Press was founded in 1987 by Bill Wege at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is now thriving under the direction of Paula Panchenko. Graphic Studio, founded in 1968 by Donald J. Saff at the University of South Florida in Tampa, is now the largest of the 3 university-based presses. Based on the scope of opportunities available to artists, that is what is unique, being in a broad, cosmopolitan, metropolitan-based university. We access scientists and researchers from across the campus. I serve as the 5th director of the studio, which is part of the Institute for Research in Art. And that is the umbrella for Graphic Studio, the Contemporary Art Museum, and a public art program. It is the skilled artisan printmaker that inspires artists to make successful translations between modes of thought and material languages. The successful relationship between the artist and the artisan encourages and directs the exploration of the potential of various processes and systems of production to produce new work. Graphic Studio currently employs 6 printers and 7 other support people and a sculpture fabricator that work under the auspices, the printers that is, of Tom Pruitt, pictured here, a Cameron-trained master printer and studio manager. It is the combined skills of the production team and the quality of productions that is the key to enticing artists to accept invitations to work in residence. Emerging and established artists are encouraged to expand their practice and use printmaking to make art that is experimental and transgressive. This has been the underlying mission since the inception of Graphic Studio. In 1972, Donald Saff began his first collaborations with Robert Rauschenberg. I'm going to talk about 3 artists that are part of the history of Graphic Studio and 3 more current projects. So Rauschenberg started working at the studio in 1972 and subsequently established his studio and living quarters on Captiva Island in southwest Florida. Bob's energy, authority, and excitement required an innovative and flexible environment. For example, his interest in chemically impregnating the fibers of paper with color led to experiments with blueprinting and sepia printing. The dull, penetrating brown and blue tones produced by the sepia and blueprint processes evoke the greasy, soiled, worn appearance of the cardboard boxes in Made in Tampa 11, produced between 1972 and 73. The use of both the blueprint and the sepia print techniques in a single work created a particular challenge, excuse me, because of the chemical antipathy of the 2 processes. The sepia section of each impression had to be printed first and allowed to completely dry. When the blueprint chemicals were applied, they had to be carefully hand brushed with the chemical solution. Rauschenberg's work at Graphic Studio challenged the traditional uniformity of an edition. Crops is a suite of 5 solvent transfer and screen print works from 1973. Bob laid out unique newspaper elements, saturated them with solvents prior to printing. Then he stood over the press and dropped these saturated strips of newsprint onto the press and then printed them. Although the format was consistent for each impression in the edition, the details vary from print to print, creating an edition varié. In 1982, Rauschenberg traveled to China. After this trip, he worked with Graphic Studio to produce Chinese Summer Hall, a 100-foot long, 30 meters, color photograph. The photograph required the purchase of a Hasselblad camera and color processing equipment. Kodak made the long paper, and several enlargers were set up in a former supermarket to expose the collages of film cut from negatives of single photographs. Well, it sounds like it was really simple and easy, but it took us almost a year to figure out exactly how to produce this 100-foot, 30-meter long color photograph. We only made 3. It's an edition of 3. Oops. Rauschenberg worked with Graphic Studio from 1972 to 1987, and during that time he produced 23 print editions, photographic studies for Chinese Summer Hall, and the photograph itself, and 4 sculpture multiples that were part of the Rauschenberg Overseas Cultural Interchange, Rocky, which was directed by Donald Saff. Rauschenberg isn't the only artist to set up a studio in Florida. After working at Graphic Studio, James Rosenquist has worked repeatedly at the studio since 1971 and established a studio in Arequipa, Florida, relatively close to the University of South Florida. He was one of the first artists to expand the scale of prints and produce multicolor lithographs, some incorporating photographic processes as well as three-dimensional elements. Mirage Morning from 1975 is a lithograph in an edition of 60, measuring 92 by 188 centimeters, with three-dimensional elements. For this project, Rosenquist used motifs found in many of his paintings and prints of the 1970s, including tire tracks, a carpenter's snap line, one of the tools of the trade that he used as a billboard painter. To create this print, the rim of a galvanized metal tub was coated with liquid tush and pressed against the lithographic plate. Carpenter's snap lines were used to form the square and triangle by dipping the string into the tush and snapping it against the plate to create the look of a chalk line. The track impressions generated horizontal waves of brilliant color across the surface of the print. Painted window shades are permanently mounted to the plexiglass and can be drawn down over the images. The creation of the imprint, the trace of the mark, is the interstitial matter that forms the dialectical image. For Shriek, produced in 1986, Rosenquist employed his skills as a painter, producing colorful monoprint fields that have lithographic elements collaged to the surface. This allowed Jim to work at a scale, 107 by 181 centimeters, not possible even on a large lithography press. The classic nature versus culture dichotomy is evoked by the combination of the commercial image, the commercial image of the female smile combined with flower forms. Robert Mapplethorpe came to Graphic Studio in 1985 and produced the studio's first photogravures. Deli Sacciolato, then director of research at the studio, is often credited with the revival of photogravure. Irises, Orchid, and Hyacinth, 3 different prints, were produced from 1986 to 1987 and measure 120 by 104 centimeters. The photogravure process imparts an atmospheric quality through the subtle grain of the aquatint ground. Now these editions were produced some directly on paper and some on silk collé, where the paper was collaged first with silk and then the print was produced. This created a soft illumination not attainable directly on the paper. Now, I'm not going to talk much about the market, but I think you might be interested to know this print sold out years ago, and we just got one back from a collector for resale, and I called the Mapplethorpe Foundation to see what the current price should be, and the ones on silk were $20,000 more than the ones directly on paper. I just thought that's a kind of interesting fact. So the price on these are now $65,000. We released them from the studio to our subscribers for $500. Roy Lichtenstein's brushstroke figures were the first works to use the wax type process. This was another innovation of the graphic studio printer artisan. Under Patrick Foy, under Don Saff, Patrick Foy, the artisan printer, developed the wax type process. Roy Lichtenstein was the first artist to embrace this new technique, and it was actually designed for him. So he created a series of brushstroke figures. Wax type is a screen printing process, but instead of ink, pigmented beeswax is squeegeed through a specially prepared steel screen. Once on the paper, the wax can be burned in with a torch and then buffed in a number of successive overlays that enhance the luminosity, translucency, and the intensity of the color saturation. This suite of 8 portraits made from 1987 to 1989 combine the wax type process with lithography and woodcut elements. Now to talk about 3 more current projects. Graphic Studio continues to be committed to a philosophy that provides artists with the freedom to experiment and pursue new directions with a broad array of materials and processes to advance their practice. While print editions are regarded as one of the most democratic forms of art production, as we've heard during this seminar, artists not invested in printmaking can appropriate techniques for qualities not available in other media, combining them with paintings and sculptures to produce unique works. Digital technologies have also extended choice and capacity, and artists working at Graphic Studio frequently combine digital with more traditional processes. Christian Markley has worked at Graphic Studio since 2006, often visiting 2 or 3 times a year. I really think we were his US studio for those years. He lives in London. His visual practice is grounded in auditory themes. His body of work spans sculpture, video, photography, music, performance, collage, and now printmaking. He has produced editions and unique works at the studio using cyanotype, lithography, etching, and screen printing. Since the late 1990s, Markley's has created graphic scores, non-traditional forms of notation for improvisational interpretation by musicians and vocal performers. From 2009 to 2010, Christian Markley worked on Manga Scroll at Graphic Studio, an 18-meter, 60 feet hand scroll, composed of collaged onomatopoeias sourced from manga comics. Markley's collages for Manga Scroll were composed both visually and sonically and intended for vocal interpretation. Manga Scroll has been exhibited internationally and performed by different vocalists at the Whitney Museum of American Art during his solo summer exhibition a few years ago, at White Cube in London, at Gallery Koyanagi in Tokyo, and on our campus at the University of South Florida. Shelley Hirsch was the vocalist for that performance. Markley, while he was working on the Manga Scroll, worked on a series of unique cyanotypes. And this process of blueprinting, which you know from the 1840s, has been reinvented both chemically and in terms of applications by the Graphic Studio staff. So it's quite archival and stable. It doesn't fade like architectural blueprint drawings. And Markley immersed himself in the cyanotype process from 2008 to 2009. He first was interested in the work that Rauschenberg had done with the cyanotype process at Graphic Studio. And other artists have also embraced this medium, like Guillermo Cuica, Arturo Herrera, and even Alex Katz, each using the process in a very different way. But no other artist has pushed the parameters of scale or worked so directly. Markley drew in a darkened room required to develop the cyanotype process. He drew with ribbons of cassette tape. You know what, remember some of you what cassette tape is? To create these layered compositions. I might add, we first tried it out on the loading dock and the wind blew everything around, so we had to develop it in our acid room, a place where he could work. And so you see him here working. With this body of work, he reinvigorated 2 nearly forgotten media. The cyanotypes of the 1840s, as I've said, and the cassette tapes of the 1970s and 80s. Music cassette tapes were found in local thrift stores in Tampa, disassembled and used as the drawing material. Some prints used the plastic cases to form austere grids. In others, spools of unwound tape have been strewn over the surface of the paper in loops and twists, recalling Cy Twombly or Jackson Pollock. We made about 150 of these unique prints, and we also produced a book with J.R.P. Rongier about documenting the cyanotypes. Titles derived from the tapes used in making each image, like All Over was the general title for this body of work, and then the subtitle Dixie Chicks, Nat King Cole, and Others, which was the title on the tape. The resulting blue photograms reveal a silhouetted image that varies in darkness due to the opacity and layers of the tapes and cassettes. The imprint actually conveys the presence of the body that made it, registering both duration and transience, presence and absence. It always reminded me, watching him work, of those films you see of Jackson Pollock painting over the cameras under the glass. He moved about almost like a dancer, choreographing the structure of the print. The unique originals vary in size from 70, I hope these translations to centimeters are accurate. Remember, I don't think in that way, but from 76 by 56 centimeters to 130 by 254 centimeters. And they've been acquired by leading museums around the world. And for me, I have to confess that that gives me a great deal of satisfaction when the work we do at the studio in collaborations with our artists is acquired by leading museums. And these were purchased or acquired through donors by the Brooklyn Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, the Guggenheim, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. So walking into the Guggenheim and seeing 4 of Christian Markley's cyanotypes produced at Graphic Studio on display really elevated my spirits. In 2013, Markley began working on a series of action prints that he produced by combining screen printing and hand painting. For this body of unique works, he focused on wet sounds, like sploosh, using onomatopoeias, again derived from comic books, which were scanned and digitally manipulated, then enlarged for screen printing. The works function ironically and reference pop art and abstract expressionism. Now I'm going to talk to you about a young artist that we just started working with a few years ago, Eva Gorgieva. I asked the question to her and to you, why would a painter embrace printmaking? Eva is a painter. Eva Gorgieva is Bulgarian-born and currently lives in Los Angeles, and she responded to this question. And now I'll quote from her. Quote, "Printmaking has the capacity to involve 2 kinds of really human primordial things, the need to make the mark and a fascination with the alchemist processes that allows for a mark that can't be made in any other way. It's a different way of condensing time in the mark." Eva had not made prints until she worked at Graphic Studio. She recognizes that making prints could not happen alone and has successfully exploited the collaborative process. She gets every printer working in the studio. They love her energy when she comes into the studio, and there's a real magic collaborative environment that develops. Gorgieva first came to Graphic Studio 6 years ago, producing printed editions and monoprints, often collaging printed elements onto her prints. In 2014, she introduced a new dimension to her practice with a series of unique sculptures with print elements. This idea came out of experiments cutting and collaging the surfaces of her paintings, exploring the shallow yet real space produced by the cut and glued edge. Taylor Pilat, a Graphic Studio sculpture fabricator, you see him on the left, found metal scraps to produce the bodies or armatures for the series of sculptures entitled Cosm. So the metal was sitting out behind the art department, and Eva and Taylor worked to pick out different scraps and then according to her instructions, Taylor welded those armatures, those bodies, if you will, that she then added her elements to. Eva worked with graphic studio printers to produce plates using a variety of techniques, including lithography, etching, soap ground, and cyanotype, generating the collage material that she layered onto epoxy clay attached to the metal structures. This epoxy clay you roll out like you're making lasagna or some kind of pastry, and for about 15 minutes you can kind of drape it at will over the structure, and then on that surface you can glue your print elements. So she added print details, she added painted details, so she went back in and painted elements, creating these unique objects. So each one is unique. The complex surfaces blur the line between the sculptural space and the perceived spaces produced by the printed and hand-painted marks. The migration of images extracted from her paintings to sculptural surfaces allow for a unique series of objects that are animated and live in their own invented world. As you would expect, Alan McCullum has taken a more conceptual approach to his projects at Graphic Studio. And just as a footnote, my first collaborative project with Alan was on the museum side of the house, and we shot rockets up into clouds and created triggered lightning strikes to produce fulgurites, which are the fusion of the silica in the sand. And we produced 10,000 copies of the fulgurite that we created with the lightning strike for an installation in the Contemporary Art Museum. So you can imagine the printers look at me with terror when I say Alan McCullum is coming to work. In 2004, he created Each and Every One of You, an arresting exploration of the emotional investment we all share in giving each other names. In an interview with Paul Bernard, he said, and I quote, "There is a fearful void in the gap between the names we are given and the presence we have with one another. I wanted to create a situation where one's life sort of flashed before one's eyes, a cacophony of all the people one has known, friends, enemies, lovers, happiness, and hurt." Hoping to evoke an avalanche of memory and feeling with the simplest of means, he researched the United States Census Bureau's in the year 2000 compilation of the most common names and produced 3 portfolios, just 3, of 1,200 prints in each portfolio, 600 of the most common female names and 600 of the most common male names. The prints were digitally produced, ordered according to popularity, so when you see them exhibited, it's to the order of their popularity, and presented in 2 handmade library boxes. When framed and installed, and framing is a whole other story, installation is a whole other story, they create an intense experience for the viewer that requires a simultaneous double perspective, whether you focus on the individual name or on the mass. McCollum's most recent project, produced in 2014 and 2015, is entitled Lands of Shadow and Substance. Do you know this series, Twilight Zone? Very famous television program from 1959 to 1964. For this project, Alan viewed the original Twilight Zone episodes on his laptop computer, capturing screenshots of scenes that included landscape paintings. So there you see the set from one of the Twilight Zone episodes, and you can see on the wall there's a landscape painting, right? So that image was digitally extracted, edited, printed, and it was all about the framing with Alan and custom framed to create this series. Each of the 27 works in this series have been printed proportionally to its original televised incarnation, and in this edition of 3. The frame prints function as dialectical objects. Their carefully chosen frames and mats add to their vagueness. Their existence is a form of poetic degradation. Lastly, we invite artists from all over the world to work at Graphic Studio. I've mostly been talking about those based in the US. But we worked quite extensively with Vic Muniz on a number of projects. And the one I'm going to tell you about, I don't think is the most important work that he did at Graphic Studio, but it's so fun that I thought I'd end with this. The original for Vic does not exist. For his suite of photogravures, and I apologize if this is too risque for you all, were finally completed in 2014, and the title of this suite is Love Bugs. All right, now there's these really pesky bugs that are in central Florida, sometimes up to parts of Georgia, and they bloom and into these huge, I don't know, blooms of these pesky bugs, and they get glued to your car, etc. And they're always copulating. Well, we were doing a project with Vic with skywriting and billboards, and he saw these, and he just thought they were so funny, so he conceived this project. So we had to capture these things, and you couldn't just drive down the highway because you got all kinds of other insects. So we developed nets. We put out on our blog, please call us if you see a swarm of love bugs, and I deployed the staff to catch them, and we brought them back to the studio, and what did we do with them? We put them in a freezer. So they were really slowed down, but they were not smushed, you know, they were still whole. And then the staff, with tweezers, carefully placed the bugs in the outlines of these diagrams of figures in Kama Sutra positions. That's what they're doing. Here's what a car looks like, and there's what the love bugs look like. The designs with the frozen bugs were photographed, and the suite was produced as photogravures. My conclusion. Graphic Studio's nonprofit status and location on the campus of a metropolitan, research-oriented university allows artists to work without commercial pressures. That's not largely true because I have to say government funding is diminishing drastically, and we only get 20% of our budget now from the university. Artists experiment with techniques often developed or refined by the collaborating printers, fabricators, and with faculty researchers across the campus. For example, note that Keith Edmeyer's project is poured basalt. He wanted to work with lava. Leading artists are interested in working in the collaborative studio environment to make work that is investigative and matches technique to concept, extending traditional methodologies of printmaking and sculpture fabrication into new realms of additioned and unique works. I like to think that we give artists an opportunity to do something that they cannot do in their studios or by themselves, that it is the collaborative environment that is so enriching to their practice. More than 105 internationally recognized artists and some emerging artists have worked in residence at Graphic Studio and produced over 750 editions, plus unique works. I have only had time to introduce you to a few projects. The Institute for Research in Art at the University of South Florida provides a mix of contemporary currency, historical overview, and scholarly and theoretical authority, serving as a broad platform for the production and critical assessment of new and often transgressive art production. I like to think of us as a laboratory for the making of art. The Institute, that's it, right? The Institute of Research, yeah.